One of the outstanding features of the property that I'm sitting on right now is that it has the most oaks, the highest density of oaks per acre of any place that I've been in the wild, period. Not just in Pennsylvania, but every single place I've ever explored. I'd estimate that as many as 90% of the trees on this property are oak trees. And there's a diversity of kinds of oaks on this property. As many as a dozen or more different varieties of oaks. And you might be thinking, whoa, 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 I thought an oak tree was an oak tree. There are actually over 600 different species of oaks all throughout the world, mostly in the northern hemisphere, but all the way down into Africa. And in the United States, there are over 100 species that have been identified by botanists. When we think about oak trees, we often think about big, strong, mighty trees. And there are plenty of them on this property. But they don't start that way, obviously. This is an oak tree. It's a little oak that has sprouted just this year. And I believe that if we peel back the layers here and are real careful so that we don't harm it in any way, there should be an acorn down in here. There's actually remnants of an acorn. And from this little acorn, so begins the life of an oak tree. You can see in front of me the density of all the oak trees that are growing up at the base of a really large oak tree, in this case a chestnut oak. These oak trees are probably 1, 2, 3, and maybe even 4 years old. The fact is that there's just as good a chance that none of these will survive to maturity, like the parent tree, than that any of them will. Animals, including deer, bear, coyotes, squirrels, love acorns. So most of them die even before they sprout. And for those that sprout, right up until late spring and early summer, animals will eat those acorns. And even when a tree sprouts, when it starts its upward growth out of the ground, it often gets browsed back by deer and other animals. And so the chances of a tree surviving are very, very slim. Some estimate that maybe 1 in every 1,000 or 1 in every 10,000 acorns actually grows into a mature tree. Some trees will actually make it to, an inch or so in diameter and still get killed by a buck rubbing its antlers against the tree, or a storm blowing down a bigger tree and snapping it off, or a person coming along and cutting it down. There are lots and lots of things that are standing against oaks becoming mature in size. One of the great saviors and the great villains of the oak tree is the squirrel. Squirrels love acorns. They'll eat them all the time, anytime they can find them. But they also bury many, many acorns that they find. You hear the phrase, you squirrel away something for another time. That's where this phrase comes from. They're notorious for storing nuts. Some studies have shown that, and I don't know exactly how they figure these things out, that as many as 70% of acorns are left behind by squirrels and they never dig them back up. Therefore, these buried acorns, not the ones that sit on top of the soil, but the ones that get buried beneath the top of the soil layer, have a much better chance of sprouting and perhaps growing up to be a big tree. Oaks are incredibly important to both animals and human beings. Animals, as I've mentioned, eat lots of acorns. They browse on the leaves. It's an important crop and an important tree for a lot of reasons. For people, oak wood is a very strong, sturdy wood. It can last a long time. It can grow to big sizes, and therefore it's really important in the lumber industry, and especially in the construction of high-level furniture and other woodworking projects that people would take part in. But my goal is not to make you into a botanist, to become an expert on oak trees. Instead, the reason I mention oak trees today is because they're mentioned several dozen times in the Bible. Let's take a look. For example, in the book of Genesis, Abraham's home, away from home if you will, is found in the Oaks of Mamre. He goes back there as a place of finding himself, of getting rest from his weariness, of just relaxing and slowing down the pace from his travels. He goes there time and time again. We see that oaks are mentioned as places where those who don't follow God harvest wood to build idols. We also see that oaks are referred to as these giant pillars, as something that stands out as a mighty oak would. One of the most intriguing passages in all of the scriptures is found in the prophetic book of Isaiah, chapter 61. And there, Isaiah is describing the situation that Israel finds itself at that historical moment. You might recall that at that time, the Babylonians had come into Israel, wiped out most of the nation, carted off a good many of the people who were still alive as slaves, knocked down all the cities, including the capital of Jerusalem and the walls that surrounded it, and unthinkably also took out the temple of God. And so Isaiah had warned Israel that if they didn't turn from their sinful ways, God was going to punish them. But here in chapter 61, instead of this message of punishment, the message has changed to a message of hope, that God is going to restore Israel. There's some debate between scholars about who is speaking in Isaiah 61 and also who it's referring to. And there are all kinds of theories ranging from Isaiah speaking himself to someone that is the ideal Israelite to this figure in the future who is going to restore things. And we'll talk more about that. But let's look at Isaiah chapter 61, especially the first 3 verses. And this is what it says. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. This passage of Scripture, much like most prophetic books in the Bible and most prophetic messages, I believe had a historical meaning at the time that it was first spoken and a future meaning. In some cases, those future meanings have perhaps already taken place, and in other ones, they're still in the future for us today in 2020. It's no doubt that Isaiah has been appointed by God to proclaim the message of chapter 61 to the nation of Israel. And as mentioned before, it's a message of hope and healing. But we also know that some of the things that are mentioned in this passage, it would be impossible for Isaiah to be able to carry them out and to be able to perform them in a real practical application. No doubt Isaiah could have preached a message of binding up the brokenhearted and proclaiming this restoration for the people of Israel. But there's no way he would have been able to carry out the year of the Lord's favor, or the year of vengeance, or the time of vengeance, that being the day of judgment. These were future events, the coming of God's kingdom in fullness and God's judgment against all people, every single one of us, sometime still in the future. This extra meaning that I talked about, a future event for the people of Israel in the 7th century or the 6th century BC, came to find its fulfillment later, and it's recorded for us in the New Testament in Luke chapter 4. Jesus actually references this very passage. He opens up the scroll of the scriptures in the synagogue one day, right after being baptized. This is his first message. And he says, after quoting this passage of scripture we just referred to on Isaiah chapter 61 verses 1 and 2, he says, as he sits down, "This has been fulfilled within your hearing today." In other words, Jesus is fulfilling what God has promised to the people of Israel in that moment, through his life, his ministry, his work. Of course, some of those things, at least in their completeness, are still future for us. The culmination of the judgment of all people is still yet to happen. The day of the Lord, in which not only judgment but eternal hope is realized, is still a future event. And yet, in a very real sense, in the person of Jesus Christ, we see that this has been fulfilled. Much of Jesus' ministry was about healing, and about preaching hope, and about taking away sickness and brokenness, and freeing those who are experiencing injustice. For our remaining moments, I want us to focus on verse 3, because there it talks about the way in which this healing is going to take place. There will be a crown of beauty for people instead of ashes, which is the sign of mourning. The oil of gladness, a celebration time, if you will, instead of mourning. And a garment of praise, that's what you're wearing, instead of a spirit of despair. The tide will turn, God is saying. But then he says this: they, the people of Israel, and as we look later in this passage, there are also foreigners, Gentiles, non-Jewish people mentioned in this passage. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. Living in a broken and really messed up world, sometimes it's easy to get caught up completely in despair, to think that there really is no hope, that we'll always be fighting at each other, and injustice will reign. And the danger of that mentality, while it's certainly true, sin is present everywhere we look, is that we give up and we don't even put any effort whatsoever into trying to be part of the solution. This week we've seen riots in Minneapolis and St. Paul and other cities throughout the United States because of injustice that took place. A man who should not be dead, who is. And we think it's impossible. There's no way that this is going to work out. And yet the message of the Bible is crystal clear. It will work out. And every little act that you or myself engages in that shows love and mercy and justice and peace is one step in that direction. Now, I'm certainly not naive to believe that we're going to create some utopian society here on earth. Sin will be present until the day of judgment. But we are still called to work towards the ways of God every single day. And when we do, when we think of somebody that's in need and we help to provide for their specific needs, and maybe we even do it anonymously, placing it on their front porch or sending it through somebody else, it brings hope and love and peace. When we reach out to a brother or sister, a person who's wronged us, a parent or a child that we've been in a long-term fighting relationship with, and we seek reconciliation, we take a step toward experiencing that beauty, that restoration, the healing that takes place. When we don't hold back in giving encouragement to other people, never mind saying derogatory things, but when we're prompted to encourage somebody, we actually act on it and speak into their lives, whether it's sending them a simple text, or writing them a note, or calling them up on the phone, or telling them in person, we stand out and we shine the light of God's glory in a dark and broken world. There is no doubt about it that there are dozens, maybe even hundreds or thousands of different unique ways in which you can be an oak of righteousness. Right living. Living rightly according to God, not according to the world's standards. In fact, I challenge you as a family or as a discipleship group, if you're by yourself, you can even engage in this alone. Maybe as a church body or wherever you find yourself, I challenge you to come up with as many specific, again I emphasize specific examples of ways that you can act rightly. Not so that people look at you and go, wow, that person's near on perfect. That person seems to be holy. That person has great moral values, or what a wonderful reputation. Not that any of those things are necessarily bad in and of themselves, but that they might reflect God's glory. That people might look at your life and say, I want to know the God that man or woman or boy or girl worships, because there's something going on in their life that's really, really pleasant. I'm reminded that this passage that Isaiah communicates to the people of Israel, which was relevant to their situation historically, but also simultaneously referred to the work of the Messiah figure that is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. That the message is still delivered to them while they're in the midst of slavery and brokenness and hurt and pain and confusion and the feeling of abandonment. You may have a serious diagnosis. You may have a wayward child that you are pulling your hair out over. You may have a parent who you haven't talked to for decades. You may have a friend who has turned their back on you completely. You may be depressed, full of anxiety, and not know where to turn. And it's in the midst of that that God says you can still experience hope. Turn to the ways of God. Turn to God Himself. And throw yourself upon Him, that you might find rest in Him. It's amazing the burden that comes off of our shoulders when we allow God to be God. When we take what He says and do it, rather than bucking against His advice and His commands. Because He created us. He knows what's best for us. And He wants to make our lives like we're a planting. Purposeful. Not just randomly dropped here or there, an acorn in the ground over here, buried by some squirrel, another one over there, but that we're planted by God and that you are right where you're supposed to be planted. To declare His splendor and beauty and greatness. You, we, as brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, are oaks of righteousness if we choose to live His way. What needs to happen today for you to be able to live that out? Is it saying no to certain things? Is it embracing difficult things? Is it recognizing that your circumstances may not change, but you still control your attitude? Is it a specific mission to speak hope into somebody's life, or to provide for their needs, or to bless somebody beyond what you think that you can sacrifice? When we do so, in the words of Martin Luther, the great reformer, we're like little Christs, little Jesus Christs that walk around the face of the earth carrying out God's ministry. May it be so in your life, in my life, in our lives, not for our glory, but for His. May peace be upon you as it comes from God. God bless you. Whoa. One of the most intriguing